Hi, I'm Leanne and welcome to my channel where we make things just because. Today I'm going to show you how I made my very first hand-woven tapestry. So this all started when I was playing The Sims 4, and as a lot of people like to do on The Sims 4, I like to replicate real-life buildings in the game. So I was making my house. I've been using this to try and decide how I want to redecorate my house moving forward, and I kept using this particular piece of artwork from the game over and over again while I was doing that. So that was when I decided that I wanted it in real life. And as always, I thought, I can do that. So this is how I did it.
The materials I used for this project are a frame. I just picked one that was closest to the size of my reference. Some yarn, you can choose any colours you wanted, but I just, again, picked the closest to my reference. I also used double knit yarn. A hammer. Some string. You want it to not be stretchy, so in this case I used parcel twine. A needle and comb. You will find out what these are for a bit later. A pencil and ruler. A template. I made this myself from a screenshot from the game, and then I used paint to draw it out. And finally, a butt ton of nails. I use those small panel pins that you often get with IKEA furniture. I began by measuring out the frame. I measured halfway along the top bar of the frame and then every quarter inch from the inside of the left bar all the way to the right, and marked these out. Once this was all done, I hammered in one of the small panel pins into each one of the intersecting marks. I then repeated this process at the bottom of the frame and ended up with this. I then began to string the frame and started by tying the parcel twine in a double knot on the first pin closest to the edge of the frame. I then strung the frame starting from where I had the first knot at the top, down to the first pin on the bottom and then up again to the second pin. So on until the frame was fully strung. I had to make sure that I was keeping the strings tight here to ensure that the strings were rigid and did not move around.
Hi all, I just wanted to drop in the middle of the video here because as you're about to see, we had a few problems with the frame for this project. As I was tightening the strings, the frame was warping and bowing, and I was really concerned that it would snap or collapse. Originally, in order to rectify this, I'd simply planned to unstring it, put the back panel for the frame back in the frame and restring it, and hope that that back panel would provide enough stability so that it would no longer warp. However, on the back panel for this particular frame, there are some little tabs around each side, and when that back panel was put back in, I wasn't able to put my nails back in, and so I wasn't able to restring it. So I just had to come up with a slightly different plan. Find a saw, go to the shed, find the wood, cut the wood, add the brace, restring, have a cup of tea and get ready to start weaving. So that was the plan, and this is what we have now. So as you can see, support is in the back of the frame and I've restrung it. There is still a little bit of bowing along the top of the frame, but I'm hoping that once the project is cut free, that will all straighten itself back out and we shouldn't have any more problems.
So with all that sorted out, I could finally get going. I started by placing the template I had made under the strings and securing them with clothes pegs. I made sure to leave room at the top and the bottom of the frame so that it could be tied later. I then threaded my first colour of yarn onto my needle. I made sure that the needle I was using had an eye big enough that the yarn would be able to fit through without any problems. I then started weaving. I started a little bit in from the edge of the frame and worked outwards towards the edge to ensure that the threads would not unravel as I carried on. I needed to ensure that I was going over one string and then under the next to be able to get the correct pattern. I also used a comb to make sure that the strings were tightly packed together. Once I got to the end of the line, I needed to turn back on myself and weave in the opposite over-under pattern. At this point, I made sure that I did not pull the yarn too tightly, as this would cause the project to warp as we moved along. As you can see, I have already deviated from the original pattern and had woven from one end of the frame all the way to the other. This had to be done so that it would stay together when it was cut off the frame later. I then changed the colour of my yarn and started on the black patterns following my template. When adding this next colour, I made sure to leave a tail at the end so that it could easily be tied off later. Once this black section was finished, I moved on to my third colour, following the same process of leaving long tails and following the template. This is when I started to have more problems. First, some of the strings started to pop off. Luckily, I noticed quickly and was able to slip them back into place. Then the frame began to split. I threw a few clamps on the frame to prevent any further splitting and carried on again. Then more strings kept popping off because the frame was splitting. Again, I slipped the strings back on and carried on. Now, regardless of all of this, we were making some progress, but it was really, really slow. So I wove, and I wove, and I wove, but I just didn't feel like I was making any progress. So let me show you what that looked like. As you can see, this took ages and I was weaving for like 10 hours a day. Finally, I decided that in order to get this finished, that I was going to need to adjust the pattern again. So from the original pattern, this is where I stopped. But it still wasn't over and I still had this mess to deal with on the back of the project. I dealt with this in two ways. The first was to tie off two threads that were close together. When I had finished doing this, there were still lots of threads that couldn't be secured. So to secure these, I wove them back into the project or over to other strings where I could tie them off. So then came the nerve-wracking moment when I had to cut the project from the frame and hope and pray that it didn't just fall apart. Luckily, we managed not to have any catastrophes here and it came off without any issues, and I actually liked it. And I decided to keep the tassels. I decided to neaten them up by giving them a trim and combing them out. Finally, it was finished and ready to frame, but not without one last hiccup. So now let me show you what we finally ended up with.
So this has been quite a journey. There were times when I never thought I was going to get it finished. There was a point when my fingers were so swollen from the weaving that my phone would no longer register my fingerprint. But ultimately, I got it done and I'm really happy with it. I think this video just goes to show that trying something new can be really scary and things really often go wrong. But if you just kind of persevere and keep going, eventually you will get there. There are, however, a few things that I think would have made this just a little bit easier, and if you wanted to do this project yourself, you may want to consider these tips. Number one, buy a loom. They are relatively inexpensive. You can get them on Amazon and you won't have to make it yourself, and you will just save yourself a whole world of hurt. Number two, use a thicker yarn. I used double knit, which gave me a really nice smooth flat finish, but it took forever and ever to weave. So use a thicker yarn, a chunky or an ultra chunky would be great, and it would also give you a more textured finish, which I think would be really nice. And finally, tip number three, start small. I've said this in the previous video and I will likely say it again, but don't be like me. This project was supposed to be really fun, but I think it's something that can easily overwhelm you, so just make it easier on yourself. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video today, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If there are any other Sims-inspired items from the game that you'd like to try and see me recreate in real life, then please let me know down in the comments. Thank you again for watching. Goodbye!